The station clock echoed like a solitary drum, marking each second as people rushed around, engrossed in their daily dramas. Sophie, dressed in an elegant suit with glistening eyes, stopped before the man sitting on the cold ground. The battered sign in his hands read, "Hungry, any help is welcome." He looked up at her with a mix of surprise and suspicion as she knelt down and whispered, "I need you to pretend to be my husband. Just for an hour." The beggar blinked, stunned, as the train approached, bringing with it the looming figure of a man she desperately wanted to avoid. The morning was still lazily stretching itself awake when Sophie stepped out for her usual start to the day. The air was filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee from nearby bakeries, blending with the clatter of wheels on cobblestones and the hum of a city that never truly rested. She liked to walk the first few blocks before catching the tube, a small ritual to organize her thoughts before diving into the chaos of work. To passers-by, Sophie was just another cog in motion. She wore a grey trench coat, her hair pulled back in a hurried bun, and carried a briefcase that seemed far too heavy for someone so delicate-looking. But behind her focused gaze was unease. For days now, Sophie had felt that something was off. It was as if a shadow had begun to follow her, a discomfort she couldn't quite pin down. Perhaps it was the endless deadlines at the bank, the insufferable boss who kept piling on the most thankless tasks, or the gnawing loneliness that pressed on her chest when she watched colleagues leave for the day while she stayed behind, burning the midnight oil alone. But it wasn't just that. It was deeper. Something she was too afraid to confront. She boarded the carriage, the city's cacophony giving way to the metallic screech of the rails and the muffled murmur of passengers. Sophie tried to focus on the page of the book tucked in her bag, but the words danced away from her mind. Instead, she found herself staring at her reflection in the darkened windows of the train, and it felt like the eyes looking back belonged to someone else, a version of her that was drifting further away with each passing day. When she finally got home that evening, drained and trying to ignore the emptiness that clung to her, she barely managed to throw together a meager dinner. The silence of her small flat was deafening, and she sank onto the sofa, hoping sleep would claim her quickly. Her phone rang at 5:43 a.m., shattering the brief stillness before her routine. The screen lit up with a name that made her stomach drop, Raymond. Hesitant, she answered, knowing she couldn't ignore him. "Darling," he began, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'll be in London today. Let's meet up. We've got so much to sort out." Sophie froze. His voice dragged up memories she had fought tooth and nail to bury, the shouting, the control, the suffocating feeling of being powerless. Raymond wasn't just an ex-boyfriend, he was the man who had nearly destroyed her. The kind of person who could make even the sunniest mornings feel like a thunderstorm. "I can't," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I have work." "Oh, sweetheart," he replied, his tone hardening. "I know where you work. I'll pick you up at 6. The call ended before she could say another word. Sophie sat there, motionless, as the silence around her grew louder. The fragile sense of safety she had carefully rebuilt over the years crumbled like a sandcastle washed away by the tide. The air in her flat felt heavier, and her heart pounded as though trying to escape her chest. She had to think. Quickly. The thought of facing him alone terrified her, but if there was one thing Raymond despised, it was public humiliation. If she could appear busy, accompanied, maybe. That's how Sophie found herself walking toward the nearest station, still in the same grey trench coat, her gaze distant and unfocused. Her hurried steps led her to the encounter that would change everything, a man sitting on the ground, his head bowed, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Any help is welcome." She stopped in front of him, her heart still pounding. He looked up, startled by her presence. Without a second thought, Sophie took a deep breath and said, "I need you to pretend to be my husband. Just for an hour." The man on the ground stared up at Sophie, his eyes wide with disbelief. Her words seemed to cut through an invisible wall, the kind he had grown used to building against the judgmental stares and indifference of the city. He was thin, his beard unkempt, wearing a coat that had clearly seen too many winters. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, thick with incredulity. Sophie glanced around, as if making sure no one else could hear them. She crouched down, leaning in just enough to keep her words from being overheard by the bustling crowd. "Yes, you," she replied, her voice urgent. "I need help. It's complicated. I don't have time to explain, but please." He studied her cautiously. It was hard to trust the sincerity of someone wearing an expensive coat while he barely had a blanket to get him through the cold nights. Yet, there was something in her eyes, a mixture of desperation and resolve, that made him hesitate before refusing outright. "I don't know what you're getting yourself into, but why me?" "Because you're the only person who won't ask too many questions," she answered, trying to steady her voice. "I just need you to pretend to be my husband. Just for an hour. After that, I'll pay you. I'll help you with whatever you need." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Your husband? Look at me. No one's going to believe that." "It doesn't matter if they believe it," Sophie shot back, her urgency spilling into her words. "It just needs to work on him." The way she said him caught the man's attention. He didn't know who he was, but it was clear enough that the person wasn't just anyone. The weight of that single word seemed heavier than Sophie could carry alone. "All right," he said finally, after a long pause. "But you'll have to give me at least a quick explanation on the way." Sophie nodded, holding out her hand to help him up. He accepted the gesture hesitantly, noticing how his dirt-streaked fingers stood in stark contrast to her perfectly manicured hand. When he finally rose to his feet, it felt as though the city around them had slowed, the moment marking a crossroads neither of them had expected to reach. "What's your name?" he asked as he adjusted his battered coat. "Sophie," she replied briskly, already walking. "And yours?" "Daniel." Sophie and Daniel weaved through the steady stream of pedestrians. The stark contrast between them didn't go unnoticed, with a few passers-by throwing curious glances their way. But Sophie was too preoccupied to care. As she tried to organize her thoughts, her eyes darted toward kiosks and shop windows, searching for anything that might help adjust Daniel's appearance. "First thing," she said, grabbing his arm and stopping in front of a small convenience shop, "we need to make you look presentable." "Presentable?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, tugging at the frayed sleeves of his coat. "I'm a beggar, not some makeover project." "For 1 hour, you're going to be something else," Sophie countered, her gaze scanning the items on display. She returned with a comb, a simple shirt, and a bottle of water. "Let's start with this." Daniel let out a deep sigh but didn't protest. As they walked toward a park bench, he watched Sophie with curiosity. It was clear she wasn't used to dealing with someone like him. Her nervousness was obvious, but there was also a genuine determination in everything she did. "Is this how you usually solve your problems?" he asked, running the comb through his dusty hair. "No," Sophie replied, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I usually avoid problems." Daniel let out a low chuckle. "Doesn't seem to be working today." She stopped for a moment and looked at him. For the first time, his ironic smile didn't seem so out of place. There was something about him that made her relax, if only for a second. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, breaking the brief silence. "I mean, why not just call a friend or something? You look like you've got enough resources to handle this some other way." Sophie averted her gaze, her hands tightening around the bottle of water she was holding. "It's complicated," she said at last. "And friends aren't exactly an option right now." Daniel caught the discomfort in her voice and decided not to push further. He already knew enough to understand that this she had mentioned earlier was a bigger problem than it seemed. After a few more blocks, they reached a laundromat. Sophie pulled some coins from her pocket and pointed to one of the machines. "Let's wash the coat. You can wear this in the meantime." She handed him the new shirt. Daniel hesitated before taking off the coat, revealing a tattered, threadbare shirt underneath. He noticed Sophie glance away, probably trying not to show her discomfort. But to his surprise, she didn't say anything. As the coat spun in the machine, Sophie took the chance to use the laundromat's Wi-Fi to check her emails. Her fingers flew across the screen as she responded to the flood of messages from her bosses, who were no doubt already piling work into her inbox. "You work a lot, don't you?" Daniel commented, watching her. "I work at a bank," she replied without looking up. "There's always something urgent. So why aren't you there now?" Sophie paused her typing for a moment but didn't answer. When the coat finished drying, they set off again. The clean coat made a noticeable difference to Daniel's appearance, and the new shirt, though simple, gave him an air of respectability that he'd lacked before. "It's not perfect, but it'll do," Sophie said, appraising him. Daniel caught his reflection in a shop window and then looked at Sophie. "Let's hope he's blind." Sophie almost laughed, but the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest stopped her. Navigating the city with Daniel had taken more time than she'd expected, and Sophie realized she was running late for work. She opened her banking app and quickly sent her boss a message, blaming her delay on transport issues. "You're going to drop me at his door and then rush off to work, aren't you?" Daniel asked as they walked. "Exactly," Sophie replied. "That's all. I don't expect you to do anything else. Just be there. You know this could backfire, right?" She stopped walking and looked him straight in the eye. "I don't have another choice." Daniel saw the seriousness etched across her face and realized this wasn't just about avoiding an awkward situation. Sophie was grappling with something that was eating away at her. He didn't know what it was, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could do something meaningful, even if it was only for an hour. Daniel still wasn't sure what to think. Sophie's request had completely blindsided him, and even as they walked side by side, he tried to make sense of why he'd agreed. This was the sort of situation he usually avoided at all costs: hurried people, full of urgency, who didn't see him as a person but as a problem to be ignored. But Sophie had looked at him differently. Not with pity or scorn, but with something else. And that was enough to keep him walking by her side. But Sophie was different. Not that he trusted her. Not yet, anyway. But there was something in her expression, in the way her voice wavered between desperation and determination, that intrigued him. She seemed like someone who'd always been capable of handling herself, but for some reason, she was now desperate enough to ask for help from the first stranger she came across. As they walked, he noticed the curious glances from people around them. It wasn't unusual for him to be stared at. He was used to being invisible, and when he was noticed, it was usually with disdain. But walking beside Sophie changed that. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged, even if only temporarily. "So, you work at a bank," he said, trying to break the silence. Sophie glanced at him briefly, almost as if she'd forgotten he was there. "Yes. 5 years now." "5 years, eh?" Daniel let out a short laugh. "Can't imagine sticking at anything for that long." "Why not?" He shrugged. "Hard to picture anything steady when you're living day to day, figuring out where you'll sleep or what you'll eat." There was a moment of silence between them. Sophie glanced at Daniel, but he looked away, focusing on the path ahead. "Have you always lived like this?" she asked, her voice softer this time. "No," he replied, a hint of bitterness slipping through. "I had a life before this. Nothing special, but it was mine. Until, well, you don't want to hear that story." "Maybe I do," Sophie said, surprising him. Daniel let out a deep sigh. Talking about the past wasn't easy, especially since it felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. "I was a teacher," he began, his voice low. "Maths. Nothing too exciting, but I was good at it. Worked at a small school, had my routine, my students, my home. And then, one day, it all fell apart. Lost my job, got behind on the rent, bills piled up, and before I knew it, I was on the streets." "But aren't there programs to help in situations like that?" Sophie asked, her brow furrowing. Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Oh, there are, sure. But have you ever tried asking for help when your dignity's already been trampled on? When every person who's supposed to lend a hand looks at you like you're just dead weight? It's easier to give up." Sophie didn't respond. She didn't know what to say, and Daniel wasn't expecting her to. He'd long stopped expecting anything from people. But the fact that Sophie was listening, actually listening, stirred something inside him. He couldn't quite place what it was, but he didn't like the feeling. "Why did you tell me that?" she asked after a moment. Daniel hesitated. "Because you asked." And for some reason he couldn't explain, Sophie felt different. She didn't look at him like others did. Not as someone above him, or as some kind of savior. There was something in the way she listened that made him feel, maybe for the first time in years, that he wasn't quite as invisible as he thought. For the rest of the walk, Daniel watched Sophie as she checked her phone, glanced at the time, and gave him quick instructions on how he should behave when they met him. Despite the tension in the air, Daniel felt something strange, a faint sense of purpose. "Are you always this organized?" he asked as they stopped by a coffee stall. "Organized?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You found me begging for help in the middle of the street. Does that seem organized to you?" Daniel let out a genuine laugh, the kind he couldn't remember the last time he'd had. "Yeah, maybe you've got a point," he said, taking the coffee she handed him. "But for some reason, I reckon you always find a way out." Sophie paused for a moment, as if processing his words. She looked at Daniel, and beneath the scruffy beard and tired eyes, she saw someone who still had a glimmer of something, hope, perhaps, or resilience. When Sophie entered the office, the air conditioning felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just the tension weighing on her shoulders. The glass doors reflected her pale face, and the sound of keyboards and ringing phones was muffled by the buzzing in her ears. She tried to focus on the emails that had piled up during her brief absence, but the words on the screen seemed distant, almost unreal. Her mind kept circling back to the encounter with Raymond. The way he'd looked at her, like he already knew something was off, still haunted her. And then there was Daniel. He'd handled the situation better than she'd expected, but Sophie knew she couldn't rely on him for long. That makeshift solution was temporary, and Raymond wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily. "You all right?" Her colleague Clara's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Sophie looked up to see Clara watching her with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sophie replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a hectic morning." Clara tilted her head but didn't press. "Well, if you need anything, just shout." Sophie nodded, grateful for the easy escape, and turned her attention back to the computer. The morning dragged on in slow motion, and every buzz of her phone made her heart race. Even when there were no notifications, she found herself checking the screen, dreading and expecting a message from Raymond at the same time. By lunchtime, Sophie couldn't bring herself to eat. She sat on a bench on the office terrace, staring down at the city below. The crowded streets felt as distant as her own thoughts. What if he finds out it's all a lie? What if he tries to hurt Daniel? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Sophie knew she needed a plan, but she was running out of options. When the clock finally struck 5 p.m., Sophie felt the weight of the day in her legs as she descended the office stairs. There was no sign of Raymond, but that only made her anxiety worse. He never missed an opportunity to act, and silence was one of his favorite weapons. At the corner near a coffee shop, Sophie found Daniel waiting for her. His coat was clean, and he was leaning against a post, watching the cars go by. "You're late," he said, his smile more relieved than accusatory. "I know," Sophie replied, rubbing her temples. "It's been a tough day." Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "Did he show up again?" "No. And that's what scares me. He doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily," Daniel said, folding his arms. "Because he's not." Sophie sighed, looking out at the horizon. "And I've got a feeling he's going to try something again. We need to be ready." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Ready how?" Sophie took a deep breath, as if searching for courage within herself. "Can you help me one more time? I don't know what he's going to do, but I'm sure this isn't over." That night, Daniel insisted on walking Sophie back to her flat. He could sense the fear lingering over her, even though she tried to mask it with quick responses and a firm posture. "You don't have to do this," Sophie said as she unlocked the door. "You're right," Daniel replied, stepping in after her. "But I want to." Sophie's flat was small but tidy. Books lined the shelves, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Daniel stood awkwardly near the door, his hands shoved in his pockets, glancing around as if afraid to touch anything. "Not used to places like this, you?" Sophie asked, noticing his hesitation. "It's not that," Daniel said quietly. "I just don't want to mess up what feels like your safe space." Sophie raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by his observation. "My safe space," she repeated, sinking onto the sofa. "If it even exists anymore." Daniel stepped forward and sat in a chair nearby, leaning forward. "Look, I know I'm not exactly the perfect candidate for this. But you've got me involved now, and I want to do this right. If he comes back, I want to be ready." Sophie studied him for a moment. He was being sincere, more so than anyone she'd encountered in a long time. "So, what are you suggesting?" Sophie asked, crossing her arms. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "I need to know more about him. Who is Raymond? What does he want from you? The more I know, the better prepared I'll be for the next round." Sophie hesitated. Talking about Raymond meant dredging up memories she'd buried. But looking at Daniel, she realized he was genuinely willing to help, maybe more than she'd thought anyone could be. Raymond doesn't handle losing control, she began, her voice low. He's manipulative, calculating, and he knows exactly how to make you feel small. When we were together, he used everything he knew about me against me. Now that we're apart, he's trying to pull me back in. Daniel nodded, taking in her words. He didn't need more details to understand the kind of man Raymond was. "All right," he said, his tone resolute. "If he wants to intimidate, we'll show him he doesn't have any power over you. Or over us." The next morning, Daniel began preparing for the inevitable second encounter with Raymond. He spent the day walking around the city, figuring out how to blend better into Sophie's world. He visited second-hand shops, hunting for clothes that looked a bit more polished, and even picked up a battered notebook to jot down ideas and phrases to help him stay in character as her husband. When he met Sophie at the agreed time, he seemed more composed, though a faint trace of unease still lingered. "You're taking this seriously, aren't you?" Sophie remarked, noticing the new coat he was wearing. "You asked for my help. So I'm doing it properly," Daniel said, a touch of pride in his voice. They walked together to the restaurant where Sophie believed Raymond would be. It was an upscale place, with marble tables and waiters in bow ties. Daniel scanned the room, feeling out of place but determined to hold his own. "There he is," Sophie whispered, gesturing discreetly to a table in the corner. Raymond was seated, scrolling through his phone, but his posture revealed he was fully aware of his surroundings. Sophie took a deep breath and walked over to him, Daniel by her side. "Raymond," she said, catching his attention. He looked up and smiled, though his eyes narrowed the moment they landed on Daniel. "Sophie," he said, feigning surprise. "And a husband. Daniel, wasn't it?" "That's right," Daniel replied, holding his gaze steady. They sat down, and the tension was almost palpable. Raymond began asking probing questions, clearly trying to unsettle Sophie, but Daniel stepped in with confident answers, steering the conversation and maintaining the facade. "So, Daniel," Raymond said casually, his tone laced with challenge, "what do you do for a living?" Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I work in consultancy." Sophie shot him a quick glance, but Raymond seized the moment. "Interesting," Raymond said, leaning forward slightly. "What kind of consultancy?" Daniel tried to respond, but his words faltered. He started rambling about finance, but his lack of familiarity with the topic quickly became apparent. Raymond's smile grew sharper, pleased with the stumble. "Ah, I see. Must be quite flexible work, then?" Sophie jumped in, swiftly changing the subject, but the damage was done. As Raymond continued to press, Daniel's frustration began to simmer. He wanted to help, but his eagerness had handed Raymond the opening he needed. When they finally left the restaurant, Sophie was visibly tense. "You were doing well," she said as they walked. "But you've got to be careful. He's very good at finding weaknesses." "I know," Daniel replied, guilt thick in his voice. "I just wanted to help." Sophie stopped and turned to face him. Despite his mistake, she could see how much he was trying, and it meant more to her than he realized. "You are helping," she said at last. "Just trust me to handle him." Outside the restaurant, Sophie crossed her arms, her eyes scanning the flow of people on the street. The silence between them was heavy, weighed down by Daniel's blunder and Sophie's growing apprehension. "I messed it all up, didn't I?" Daniel broke the silence, kicking a small pebble along the pavement. "You didn't mess it all up," Sophie replied, trying to sound firm. But we have to be more cautious. Raymond's always one step ahead, and he'll use any mistake to his advantage. Before Daniel could respond, the restaurant door swung open, and Raymond appeared. He walked towards them with the same air of confidence, now holding a leather folder more tightly in his hand. "All sorted in there," Raymond said as he joined them. His smile was controlled, but there was a calculating glint in his eyes. "I hope you've still got some time. There's something I'd like to show you both." Sophie exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. She knew it wasn't a good idea, but refusing would only play into Raymond's hands. "All right," she said finally, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. Raymond led them to a small cafe at the end of the street, away from the hustle and bustle. He chose a secluded table, pulling out a chair for Sophie with exaggerated politeness before sitting opposite her. Daniel remained by her side, doing his best to hide his unease. "So, Raymond," Sophie said, crossing her arms. "What's so important that you had to bring us here?" Raymond leaned forward, opening the leather folder on the table. He pulled out a thick white envelope and placed it in front of her, tapping his fingers lightly against the paper. "This landed in my lap recently," he said with a rehearsed calm. "I thought you'd want to see it." Sophie eyed the envelope warily before picking it up. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it and pulled out the contents. Daniel watched her closely, trying to gauge her reaction as she read. Her face hardened, and with a sharp motion, she placed the papers back on the table. "What do you think you're playing at?" she asked, her voice low but brimming with restrained anger. "I just wanted to make sure you were aware of the situation," Raymond said, leaning back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. Daniel couldn't stop himself from glancing at the papers on the table. He recognized them immediately: legal documents, a court notice. "You've filed a case against me?" Sophie asked, her eyes locked on Raymond's. "Not exactly," Raymond replied, feigning innocence. "I just thought it was time to resolve a few lingering matters. You know how it is. Nothing personal, darling." Sophie sat silent for a moment, her mind racing to process what was happening. "You're trying to intimidate me," she said at last, her voice controlled but dripping with venom. "That's all this is. You can't stand that I've moved on." Raymond shrugged, a cold smile on his lips. "I simply do what needs to be done." Daniel, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his expression firm. "You're using the legal system to harass her?" he asked, his voice laced with indignation. Raymond turned to him, his smile almost amused. "And what exactly do you think you can do about it?" "More than you might expect," Daniel replied, the conviction in his voice catching even Sophie off guard. Raymond chuckled, shaking his head. "You're quite the character, Daniel. But I don't think you're ready for what you've stepped into." Daniel opened his mouth to retort, but Sophie placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "It's not worth it," she said, her gaze fixed on Raymond. "You can try whatever you want, but you won't break me. Not this time." Raymond raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "If that's how you want to play it, fine. But remember, Sophie, I always find a way to win." He stood, tucking the folder under his arm and straightening his suit. "Lovely meeting you, Daniel. I'm sure we'll cross paths again." The moment Raymond left the cafe, Sophie exhaled the breath she'd been holding. Daniel turned to her, his frustration evident. "Why did you stop me?" he asked. "I could have said something." "Something he'd use against us," Sophie interrupted. "Raymond is dangerous, Daniel. The less ammunition we give him, the better. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to contain his frustration. I just want to help. I know, Sophie said softly. And you are. But sometimes, the best help is silence. Daniel nodded, though the set of his jaw showed he wasn't fully convinced. Sophie sat frozen in her chair, Raymond's parting words echoing in her mind. The papers still lay on the table, a cruel reminder that she had nowhere to run. She picked up the envelope, folding it carefully, though her hands were trembling. Are you all right? Daniel asked, his voice quiet. No, Sophie admitted, her eyes fixed on the table. I don't know how he got this. I don't know how to fix it. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. He seemed to struggle to find something helpful to say. There must be someone who can help, he said eventually. A friend? A lawyer? Someone you trust? Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Friends aren't exactly my forte, Daniel. I barely have time for myself, let alone for building relationships. Family, then, he pressed gently. Do you have anyone? A relative who could? She cut him off, raising a hand. My family isn't part of my life. Daniel leaned back, studying her in silence. Sophie seemed to be building walls around herself, but he knew that to deal with this, she'd have to let them down. I know you don't trust me much, he said, carefully choosing his words. But if there's anyone at all, even if you think it's a long shot, now's the time to try. Sophie lowered her head, clutching the envelope tightly. She hated to admit it, but Daniel was right. Her mind searched desperately for answers, and then a memory surfaced, bringing with it a weight she'd tried to ignore for years. My father, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, intrigued. Your dad? His, complicated, Sophie said, her voice hesitant. We haven't spoken in years. But he's powerful. He has resources. Daniel noticed that just mentioning her father made Sophie seem more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. And why don't you talk to him? He asked cautiously. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes a mix of anger and sadness. Because my father's a banker, Daniel. He's calculating, cold. To him, everything's transactional, even family. I left home because I didn't want to be part of his world. But you said he's got resources, Daniel pressed. If he can help, maybe it's time to swallow your pride. It's not pride, Sophie shot back. It's survival. He's never done anything without expecting something in return. And I know that if I go to him now, I'll be tied to him again. Daniel stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air. He understood what it was like to feel trapped by someone who held power over you. But he also knew that sometimes survival meant making tough choices. You don't have to trust him, Daniel said finally. But you do need to sort this out. If he can help, maybe it's worth a shot. Sophie stared at him, still unsure. But deep down, she knew she didn't have any other options. I hate that you're right, she said, standing up from her chair. So do I, Daniel replied with a slight smile. When Sophie decided to reach out to her father, the weight of the choice felt heavier than she'd imagined. As they walked back to her flat, her eyes stayed fixed on the pavement, as if each step took her closer to an internal battle she'd been avoiding for years. Daniel, sensing her silence, stayed by her side, respecting the space she seemed to need. But he knew that when the moment came, she'd need more than just words. Do you know how to find him? Daniel asked when they reached her door. Sophie hesitated before answering. Yes. He's never exactly been hard to track down. So, what are we waiting for? I don't know, she said, finally meeting his eyes. Maybe courage. Daniel nodded, crossing his arms. All right. Let's start with the basics. What are you going to say to him? That I need help, Sophie replied, her tone sharper than she intended. That I'm desperate. That I hate having to ask. Daniel leaned back against the wall, watching her. And what's he going to say? Sophie was silent for a moment before answering. He'll say he's been waiting for me to come back. And then he'll use it against me. The next day, Sophie and Daniel took a taxi to the building where her father worked. The structure loomed over them, a towering monolith of glass and steel reflecting London's grey sky. Sophie felt small beside it, as if the entire place had been designed to make her feel insignificant. Do you want me to go in with you? Daniel asked as they stepped out of the taxi. Yes, Sophie answered without hesitation. But don't say anything. Let me handle him. Daniel nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets as he followed her inside. The interior of the building was as imposing as the exterior, polished marble floors, receptionists in sharp uniforms, and a lobby that felt more like a five-star hotel. Sophie walked up to the desk, trying to ignore the curious looks Daniel attracted. I'm here to see Edward Campbell, she said, her voice steady, though there was a faint tremor beneath it. The receptionist gave her a professional smile. Mr. Campbell is on the 15th floor. Is he expecting you? No, Sophie replied, pulling out her phone and typing quickly. But he will be shortly. As they waited, Daniel leaned in and whispered, You've got a knack for dealing with people like this, haven't you? I learned it by watching him, Sophie said, her eyes still fixed ahead. A few minutes later, they were given the go-ahead to head up. Sophie felt her heart race as the lift ascended, each number lighting up on the panel like a countdown. When the doors finally slid open, she took a deep breath before stepping into her father's office. Edward Campbell sat behind an enormous desk, poring over documents with meticulous attention. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his expression shifted from surprise to a composed smile. Sophie, he said, rising and straightening his suit jacket. What an unexpected surprise. Father, Sophie replied, keeping her distance. The two stood in silence for a moment, sizing each other up. Edward broke the stalemate, his eyes drifting to Daniel. And who's this? Daniel, Sophie answered quickly. He's a friend. Daniel nodded politely but kept silent, just as she'd asked. Very well, Edward said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. So, what brings you here, Sophie? I thought you decided to go your own way, far from all of this. Sophie lowered herself into a chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. I need help, she said bluntly. Edward raised an eyebrow. Help? Yes. Someone's threatening me. And now they've filed a lawsuit against me. I can't handle this on my own. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. And you think I can handle it? You can, Sophie said, her voice steadier now. You know the right people. You've got the resources. And I don't have a choice. Edward was silent for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I can help, Sophie. But you know nothing comes for free. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out. What do you want? Edward smiled. Oh, my dear, that's something we can discuss later. For now, tell me more about this problem of yours. Sophie's fingers tightened around each other in her lap as she tried to gather her thoughts. The silence in the office seemed to magnify every sound, each breath, each tick of the clock on the wall. Edward leaned back, watching her with his calculating gaze, waiting patiently for her explanation. "It's complicated," Sophie began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't doubt it," Edward replied with a faint trace of irony. "Do go on." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "There's someone from my past. He's trying to." The words faltered, caught under the weight of her father's unrelenting stare. Edward raised an eyebrow but said nothing, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy hand. He wants control," she managed, stumbling over the words. "And now he's found a way to threaten me, legally. He's filed a lawsuit, but it's baseless?" Edward offered, leaning forward slightly. "Yes. But he knows I don't have the resources to fight it," Sophie admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I see." Edward folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. "And why, exactly, is this man so determined to ruin you?" "Because he can't accept that I left him," Sophie replied, her voice growing quieter with each word. Edward sat back again, as if considering her answer. The weight of his judgment was unbearable, and Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Let me get this straight," Edward said finally. "You allowed someone into your life who's caused all this chaos. And now, instead of handling it yourself, you've come to me for help." "I didn't have a choice," Sophie shot back, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do." Edward sighed, his eyes drifting back to the documents on his desk, as though he were already growing bored. "And who is this man? An ex? A professional rival? Some sort of sociopath?" "He's my ex," Sophie admitted, the words dragging painfully from her mouth. "But he's dangerous. Not just to me." Edward remained silent, his gaze fixed on Sophie as if trying to measure the gravity of her situation. Finally, he shifted his attention to Daniel, seated nearby and visibly uneasy. "And you, Daniel," Edward said, clasping his hands on the desk. "What's your take on all this?" Daniel looked up quickly, as if caught off guard. He glanced at Sophie, who seemed even more tense, before turning back to Edward. "I'd say she's being modest," Daniel began, his tone steady but not confrontational. "This man isn't just trying to intimidate her. He's calculated. He wants to tear down everything she's built, and he knows exactly how to use that to his advantage." Edward tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "And how do you know this?" Daniel hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "Because I've dealt with people like him before. People who know exactly where to press to make it hurt. I've seen it happen." Edward held Daniel's gaze for a few beats longer before shifting his focus back to Sophie. "And what exactly is his role in all this?" Daniel answered before Sophie could. "I'm here because she needed someone. And I'll keep helping as long as she needs me." Edward let out a brief laugh, as if amused. "Interesting. It seems you've found yourself an ally, Sophie." Sophie remained silent, feeling the familiar weight of her father's judgment. "I'll need more details about this lawsuit," Edward continued, turning back to Sophie. "But from what I'm hearing, this is something that can be handled. The question is, what are you willing to do to ensure it's resolved?" Sophie looked at her father, feeling like a pawn on a chessboard he controlled. She wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The silence following Edward's question seemed to drain the air from the room. Sophie stared at him, trying to decipher his intentions. She knew that any help from him would come with a cost, but she couldn't yet see how high that cost might be. "What do you mean by that?" Sophie asked, trying to sound firm, though her voice wavered at the end. Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and clasping his hands together. "I mean that everything comes at a price, Sophie. You know that better than anyone. If I'm to use my resources to resolve your situation, I need to be sure there will be something in it for me." Sophie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Something in it for you?" "Yes," Edward replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I want you back at the bank. Back with the family. I've spent years building an empire, and it would be good to have you by my side again. Of course, it's not mandatory. But if you want my help, that's the deal." Sophie clenched her hands tightly, her heart pounding. Returning to her father's world was the last thing she wanted. She'd fought so hard to escape that suffocating environment, and now it felt like every choice she'd made was being stripped away. "I can't," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "Can't or won't?" Edward countered, leaning in closer. "Because I'd say you don't have another option." Daniel, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke up. "With all due respect, Mr. Campbell," he said, his tone calm but resolute, "I think you're underestimating Sophie's ability to handle this on her own. She came to you for guidance, not because she's desperate to come back to your world." Edward turned slowly to Daniel, a cold smile playing on his lips. "And you think you understand my daughter better than I do?" "I think I understand the situation she's in right now," Daniel replied, holding Edward's gaze. "And I know that if she wanted to return to the bank, she'd have done it on her own terms." Edward was silent for a moment, studying Daniel as if he were an intriguing piece of a puzzle. "Interesting," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "You've got nerve, Daniel. I like that. But nerve without strategy is useless." Sophie took a deep breath, trying to summon the strength to speak again. "Dad," she said, her voice steadier this time, "I can't come back. I won't come back. But I need your help, not as an employee, or an heir. As your daughter." The final word carried a particular weight. Edward stayed motionless, his gaze fixed on her, as an uncomfortable silence filled the room. At last, he exhaled a long sigh, as if weighing his decision. "Very well," he said, rising from his chair. "I'll take care of it. But you know this means that, in the future, I'll expect your cooperation in other matters." Sophie felt the weight of his words, but knew she had no other choice. She nodded slowly, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "Excellent," Edward said, pressing a button on the phone on his desk. "Send my legal team up. Immediately." He cast one final glance at Sophie before turning toward the window. "You've made the right choice, Sophie. Don't worry. We'll handle this." Edward wasted no time. The moment his legal team entered the office, he took control of the situation with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Sophie and Daniel sat quietly, almost invisible, as Edward delegated tasks and scrutinized the documents with a critical eye. "This is absurd," Edward said, flipping through the lawsuit Sophie had brought. "A cheap legal stunt, but annoyingly effective for someone without proper support. Fortunately, that won't be an issue here." One of the lawyers, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses, leaned in to speak. "We'll need to file a motion to dismiss immediately, sir. But for that, we'll need more details on what's driving this case." Edward turned to Sophie, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Sophie, I need everything. Every conversation, every email. Anything you have on this man." Sophie felt the weight of the moment. Telling him everything meant reliving painful experiences, but she knew Edward wouldn't accept less. "He's my ex," she began hesitantly. "We broke up a few years ago, but he didn't take it well. He started showing up at my flat, following me. I moved and managed to avoid him for a while. But now he's found a way back. This lawsuit, it's just a way to harass me through the courts." Edward nodded, as though listening to a routine case, his expression unreadable. "And how, exactly, is he doing this?" "He's claiming I made defamatory statements that damaged his career," Sophie said, clasping her hands tightly. "But it's a lie. He's fabricating it to intimidate me." "Understood," Edward said, turning to his team. "I want a full analysis of this case within 48 hours. And investigate this man's background. Any weakness you find, bring it to me." The lawyers nodded and left the room swiftly, leaving behind a heavy silence. Once they were alone again, Edward turned to Sophie and Daniel. "This will be handled," he said confidently. "But you need to understand that the cost here isn't just financial, Sophie. You're putting me in a position of exposure, and I'll expect that to be repaid in the future." Sophie nodded, unable to respond. "You should go home and get some rest," Edward continued. "Let me deal with this. I'll let you know as soon as there's news." Sophie stood, her legs feeling like lead. Daniel followed close behind, but before they reached the door, Edward called out to him. "Daniel," Edward said, with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You're loyal. That's admirable. But remember this, loyalty without results is worthless." Daniel held Edward's gaze for a moment before leaving without a word. When they finally stepped out of the building, Sophie exhaled deeply, trying to release the tension that seemed to grip every muscle in her body. "Well, that was intense," Daniel said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "That's my father," Sophie replied bitterly. "He solves problems, but there's always a price." "He seems to know what he's doing," Daniel remarked. "But what about you? Are you all right with this?" Sophie looked at him, exhaustion etched across her face. "I don't have much of a choice. I just hope it's over soon." Daniel nodded, though the worry in his eyes was clear. He knew the fight with Raymond wouldn't be simple, and Edward, for all his expertise, never did anything without a greater agenda in mind. Over the following days, Sophie heard little directly from her father. He preferred to have his legal team handle communication, which meant her phone was constantly flooded with messages and calls requesting more details and documents. Each interaction was a reminder of how much she hated depending on him. "Is it always like this?" Daniel asked as Sophie rolled her eyes at yet another email on her phone. "Yes," she said, exasperated. "With him, everything is bureaucracy and control. He loves making things seem more complicated than they actually are." Daniel smirked. "At least he's getting things done. That's more than we could have managed on our own." "I know," Sophie admitted, slipping her phone back into her bag. "But the more he does, the more it feels like I'm sinking into something I can't get out of." That afternoon, Edward contacted Sophie directly. His tone was dry and curt, but there was a hint of satisfaction underlying his words. "My team has what they need," he said. "And there's something interesting in Raymond's history." "What is it?" Sophie asked, her heart racing. "He has a pattern of questionable lawsuits," Edward explained. "Several were dismissed, but one in particular stood out. An ex-girlfriend filed a restraining order against him 3 years ago. It seems he has a history. Sophie felt a knot form in her stomach. Can that help us? Undoubtedly, Edward replied. We're already building a strategy to expose it and have his case dismissed before it can progress. However, be prepared. When he realizes he no longer has legal leverage, he may try a more direct approach. Do you think he'll show up in person? I'd bet on it, Edward said without hesitation. That evening, Sophie received a message from an unknown number. The text was short but brimming with menace. You think you'll get away that easily? This isn't over. She showed the message to Daniel, who immediately suggested going to the police. And what am I supposed to tell them? Sophie asked, gripping her phone tightly. That he sent me a threatening text. They won't do anything. Then we'll do something ourselves, Daniel said resolutely. If he shows up, we'll be ready. Ready how? Sophie asked, frustration spilling into her voice. Leave that to me, Daniel replied, his tone firmer than ever. Raymond, meanwhile, wasn't about to accept defeat. When his lawyer informed him about Edward's strategy and the likely collapse of his case, he remained unfazed. I knew she couldn't handle this alone, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. But that doesn't mean it's over. Sir, I must remind you, the lawyer cautioned, any reckless action could damage your position further. You stick to your laws, Raymond replied, adjusting his suit. I'll handle the rest. 2 days later, Raymond appeared unannounced outside the building where Sophie worked. He stood by the entrance, wearing a confident smile, his sharp eyes scanning everyone coming and going. When Sophie spotted him, her stomach dropped. She had left early that morning to grab coffee with Daniel before work, and now they were returning. He's here, Sophie whispered, stopping abruptly. Daniel followed her gaze and saw Raymond. The man appeared relaxed, but there was something undeniably menacing about his presence. Do you want to go past him or take another route? Daniel asked. If I avoid him now, he'll just keep coming back. I don't think I have a choice. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then we go together. Sophie took a deep breath and started walking towards Raymond. The moment he saw her, he turned, a false smile spreading across his face. Sophie, he said, spreading his arms wide like they were old friends. What a pleasure to see you. She stopped a few steps away, keeping her distance. What do you want, Raymond? I want to talk, he replied, completely ignoring Daniel. After all, there's so much we could settle without lawyers and courts. There's nothing to settle, Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. Raymond stepped forward, but Daniel moved between them, forcing him to stop. And who are you to get in the way? Raymond asked, his smile fading. Someone who's not going to let you intimidate her, Daniel replied, his voice calm but resolute. Raymond laughed, shaking his head. You think you can stop me? You've no idea who you're dealing with. I know enough, Daniel said, holding his ground. Raymond stared at them for a moment before stepping back, adjusting his suit. Fine. I'll give you some time. But remember, Sophie, this isn't over. He turned and began to walk away, but not before throwing one last threatening glance at Daniel. The following days were an emotional rollercoaster for Sophie. While Edward's investigations were successfully dismantling Raymond's legal case, his unpredictable behavior kept her constantly on edge. Every knock at the door, every message on her phone felt like it could be the start of another attack. Daniel, meanwhile, became increasingly protective, accompanying her wherever he could. Though his support was crucial, Sophie started to notice how much the situation was taking its toll on him too. "You don't have to do all this," she said one evening, as they sat in her flat sharing cold pizza. "I want to," Daniel replied simply. "And besides, I think I'm in too deep to back out now." Sophie smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She knew Daniel wanted to help, but she feared he was putting himself in more danger than he realized. The next evening, as Sophie and Daniel returned from a quick dinner at a nearby restaurant, something shifted. The air felt heavier, and Daniel, with his sharp instincts, sensed they were being followed. "Keep walking," he said quietly, leaning towards Sophie. "Don't look back." "Is it him?" Sophie asked, her heart pounding. "Could be," Daniel replied. "But let's not stick around to find out." They turned a corner into a quieter street, but Raymond suddenly appeared, blocking their path. Behind him, two unfamiliar men loomed, clearly his accomplices. "You really thought you could get away from me, Sophie?" Raymond said, his voice dripping with contempt. Daniel immediately stepped in front of Sophie. "That's enough, Raymond. This ends here. You think you can stop me?" Raymond laughed, his eyes glinting with restrained fury. "You're a nobody. And you," he pointed at Sophie, "will always be weak, relying on others to save you." Daniel didn't wait. He lunged at Raymond, but one of the men stepped in, shoving Daniel hard against a wall. Sophie screamed, but before she could act, Raymond grabbed her arm. "You think lawyers and lawsuits will stop me?" he hissed, leaning dangerously close. "I don't need any of that to control you." Before Sophie could respond, Daniel broke free from the man holding him and shoved Raymond away from her. The force sent Raymond stumbling to the ground, and the other two men hesitated, caught off guard by Daniel's unexpected strength. "Get out," Daniel said, his voice filled with a fiery intensity that even surprised Sophie. Raymond stood slowly, brushing off his suit. "This isn't over," he said, glaring at Sophie. "Next time, I won't be so patient." He gestured to the other men, and the three of them disappeared into the darkness. Back at the flat, Sophie was shaking. Daniel handed her a glass of water but stayed quiet, waiting for her to speak. "I can't take this anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sat down beside her, silently waiting. "I spent years running from him, trying to build a life far away from all this. And now it feels like none of that matters." "It does matter," Daniel said, placing his hand gently over hers. "Because you're not alone anymore. And because this time, he's not going to win." Sophie looked at him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I just don't know what to do now." "Yes, you do," Daniel said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You just need to face it. Once and for all." Sophie took a deep breath, nodding slowly. He was right. She knew the final confrontation was inevitable. And now, with Daniel by her side and Edward's strategic backing, she felt that, perhaps, she had a real chance. The next morning, Sophie and Daniel arrived at Edward's office. He was waiting for them, more serious than usual. "I received a report this morning," Edward began, handing an envelope to Sophie. "It appears Raymond isn't just involved in questionable lawsuits. He's also tied to significant financial fraud. If this comes to light, he'll lose everything." Sophie skimmed the document, a wave of both relief and apprehension washing over her. "This is enough to destroy him," Edward continued. "But you need to decide if you're willing to see it through. That means taking this to court and exposing every bit of his mess. Sophie glanced at Daniel, who nodded, encouraging her. I want to end this, she said finally, her voice resolute. Armed with evidence, Edward and his team filed a case against Raymond, exposing his fraudulent activities and dismantling the lawsuit he'd filed against Sophie. The legal pressure was enough to push him out of her life, but Sophie knew the emotional toll had been steep. Still, something felt different this time. She wasn't running anymore. And as she looked at Daniel, she realized she'd found something unexpected amidst the chaos. Someone who not only stood by her but believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. Thank you, she said to him as they walked together through the park after receiving the news that the case had been dismissed. For what? He asked, smiling slightly. For not giving up on me, Sophie replied, smiling back. Daniel draped an arm around her shoulders as they continued walking. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like she could breathe again. The case against Raymond had been dismissed, and the evidence against him was now under investigation by the authorities. Sophie could finally begin to put her fear behind her, though the emotional scars remained. She and Daniel met at the same cafe where it had all started, but the atmosphere this time was completely different. Sophie looked lighter, and Daniel, though still wearing his worn coat, had an air of quiet confidence about him. So, what's next for you? Daniel asked, holding his coffee cup in both hands. I'll stick with the bank for now, Sophie replied with a faint smile. But I think I'm finally ready to start figuring out what I really want to do with my life. Daniel nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He didn't say anything, but Sophie noticed something in his expression. And what about you? She asked, leaning slightly across the table. You can't keep living on the streets, Daniel. That's not a life. He shrugged, trying to brush it off. I get by. That's not enough, Sophie said firmly, her tone kind but insistent. You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn. We'll find something, a job, a place to start fresh. Daniel looked at her for a moment before letting out a short laugh. You're relentless, aren't you? Not one bit, Sophie replied, grinning. After the cafe, the two decided to take a walk through the park. Sophie felt it was a good way to process everything that had happened, while Daniel seemed to simply enjoy the moment. As they strolled, an elegantly dressed man passed by, wearing a pristine suit and carrying a leather briefcase eerily similar to Raymond's. He glanced at them for a brief second before continuing on. Sophie's body froze, and Daniel immediately stepped closer to her side. Is it him? Daniel asked, the tension clear in his voice. I don't know, Sophie replied, her heart racing. The man stopped, noticing their nervous glances, and offered a polite smile. Excuse me, he said gently. I was just trying to remember if I'd seen you somewhere before. Sophie and Daniel exchanged a quick look before letting out awkward laughs. Sorry, Sophie said, shaking her head. We mistook you for someone else. No problem, the man replied, smiling again before continuing on his way. As he disappeared into the distance, Sophie exhaled deeply, realizing she'd been holding her breath. For a second there, I thought we were back to square one, Daniel said, chuckling. Me too, Sophie replied, laughing along with him. They resumed walking, and Sophie realized that, for the first time in ages, she truly felt safe. Thank you, Daniel said suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. For what? For not giving up on me, he replied, echoing the words she'd said to him earlier. Sophie smiled, understanding that this moment marked the beginning of something new, not just for her, but for both of them. As they continued strolling through the park, Sophie glanced at Daniel, who looked more at ease than she'd seen him in weeks. Yet, she knew that despite the laughter and their recent small victories, he still had a long way to go. "So," she said, gently tugging his arm to make him stop, "where do we start? Because you're not carrying on as you are. I've promised myself I'll help you." Daniel laughed, but there was a glimmer of emotion in his eyes. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But if it's with you, I think we'll figure something out." Sophie smiled, her familiar determination shining through. "We'll sort it together." They carried on walking, laughing about the coincidences and challenges that had brought them together. Neither of them had all the answers, but for the first time, the future didn't feel quite so daunting. Have you ever felt lost like Sophie or needed to help someone like Daniel? Share your stories in the comments about how you overcame tough times. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more heartwarming stories that inspire and connect. Share this with someone who could use a bit of hope today. See you in the next video.